Hey everybody, and today we're going to be talking about Path of Exile 2. In particular, we're going to be talking about updates I've done to my warrior build that I think bring it up to about as much as it can go in Path of Exile 2, at least until I add some more abilities or things like that, which I'll go into later. But I think that the build I have now pretty much will get you through the entire game to its end game. At the very least, it's gotten me to its end game. I've beaten pinnacle bosses with it, so I know it's got to be doing something right. I don't think it's literally the best warrior build, maybe not for killing bosses, but I think it clears maps just about as well as any other warrior build, and I really haven't had any issues with it, so I think it's actually a really good one. So as I do this introduction, a lot of you guys have complained that introductions are a bit too long and people just want me to get to the point. I don't really think that's what my videos are. If you just want to see someone do like a 5 to 10 minute rundown on here's my new build and he quickly slaps something together, there are people who do those sorts of videos. I want to show you footage of what my build's doing. I want to tell you what it's doing. I want to go over it, and I want you guys to kind of learn, because a lot of what's in my build is kind of jank and made up as I go along. So if you kind of get some takeaways from it, you can learn to build a little bit better, maybe do your own thing. And well, in addition to that, a lot of you guys are playing ARPGs anyway, right? So put me on your second monitor, just listen to me, put me on your TV, listen to me on your phone, go to sleep to the video, right? Like, you got time. With that said, do make sure to like, do make sure to subscribe, leave a comment down below, and we're going to be going over the build, what I changed, what I think is working with it, why I think it's working. And you can, again, I got some video footage in front of you so you can see it is wave clearing pretty well. So let's go talk about the build then. Before I go into the build, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment down below and any of your thoughts. These things help me massively, and I'd have to say it each time for the YouTube algorithm. So I've done 2 videos now on more melee oriented warriors, and this is sort of the culmination of all those different builds. This is kind of the final idea of what I've got for the hyper late game. So as you probably see in some of this footage, the later and later into the game you go, the more and more spammy the end game gets, and less you're able to actually like tactically do anything. At a certain point, you're basically just running around trying to AoE enemies as much as possible. I was originally trying to use magma barrier, and that was working, but having to, you know, time my parries for each enemy when there's particularly maybe like 40 around me during a breach becomes difficult. I kind of needed a setup where I could just instantly annihilate everything around me. So they did buff Resonating Shield, and you might be thinking, is this build viable because of Resonating Shield? Is that what happened? Well, no, not really. The Resonating Shield buff barely did anything. Since the developers originally did that buff, I've gone barely up any DPS, and the majority of that has actually just been because of different changes to my build. Basically, this comes down to using Armor Explosion. Now, everyone was using Armor Explosion on their more main abilities, things like Stampede, things like their left click, things like that. They were just doing giga armor explosions that wiped an entire map, and that's what I was doing at first, and that's why me and most other people didn't even try it on Resonating Shield, despite it seeming like, you know, that would be a really good build, that it would be viable, blah, blah, blah. I experimented with a bunch of different strategies and came back to the thought that, you know what, screw it, let's just try Armor Explosion on Resonating Shield. Now, the idea behind Boneshatter, because we're always trying to set up Boneshatter. I've really liked Boneshatter for the longest time, and as you see in all that footage I keep showing you, the Boneshatter AoEs into other people. I'm going to complete my thoughts on Resonating Shield, then we'll talk about why Boneshatter works so much. But so what we do with Resonating Shield is we want to get them into the stun threshold. What do they call that? The primed for stun. You need 40% of your stun, your heavy stun buildup on a normal monster, 60% from magic, rare at 70%, unique at 80%. If it's at that threshold of its stun buildup, then Boneshatter comes in and you can hit him with that. So the idea is you want a build that does just enough damage that brings them into that stun threshold without actually stunning them. There's not many abilities in this game that do so low damage. A couple days ago I was making a joke that because enemies barely ever got more HP per level, and because the amount of damage in the game kept going up, that I was going to be able to eventually AoE all the mobs down with Resonating Shield. Well, it's not entirely true, but because the damage in the late game just continues to go up and up and up and up, and enemies very rarely actually get more HP, this has ironically eventually made it that Resonating Shield does have a combo setup. Now, it's highly unlikely that Resonating Shield will ever stun enemies. Sometimes it will kill them, but when it kills them, they tend to just be dead anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So the general idea here with Resonating Shield is we got the Armor Explosion. It shreds armor at each hit. The Armor Explosion does a little bit of damage. The regular, these hits barely do any damage, but the Armor Explosion comes out. It does a good bit of damage, typically brings them in. It either wipes out all the smaller enemies that are very spammy, or against some more mid-sized enemies, it does the Armor Explosion, and then you can set that up into a Boneshatter. Against the larger enemies like the Goliath or some of these bigger dudes, you might need to actually auto-attack them, then Boneshatter, but the combo does work out pretty well. So on Resonating Shield, I only got 3 sockets here. You can do all this build very easily, and I'll explain. The majority of the build right now is just Resonating Shield, Boneshatter. It's just a 1-2 setup. I rarely see anyone use it, and yet I think there's a couple tricks that really just make it work. So one, we have mobility on Resonating Shield. Now, you will be noticing a problem. Resonating Shield will be obliterating your mana. You might need some mana fixers, be it some mana on items, or one thing I did over here is I went Blood Rush. 6% of skill cost was converted to life cost. So there are some things you can do to fix it. Now, how quickly it attacks is based on your attack speed and your skill speed. It does have a base attack speed of 0.8 that is not affected at all by whichever weapon you're using. You can use the slowest, hardest hitting weapon entirely. It will still hit at 0.8 seconds. I say 0.8 times per second. So it's a pretty slow attacking ability to begin with. In addition to it being a very slow attacking ability, it barely shreds any armor. So while it will generally be pretty good at shredding the armor of the smaller enemies, against the bigger enemies, you don't really want to be sitting there against the unique enemies, the boss monsters, and you want to be sitting there just, you know, bonk, 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 bonk. You don't want to be doing that for long periods of time, so I have, of course, gone with Demolisher. Now, mobility means, as I went over in my last video, you can move a little bit more while you're doing this. So this makes, the primary advantage of this is it actually helps you clear a little bit quicker. It sounds dumb, but it is actually kind of important. By just being able to bonk like this and you're bonking forward like that, you're significantly less slowed, which helps you keep up in pace with other builds. The Armor Explosion goes kaboom, and then of course the Demolisher allows you to break more armor. Early in the game, you can probably just get away with Armor Explosion Mobility or just Armor Explosion Demolisher. If you're trying to do this build at the lower levels, that's probably what I'd recommend doing. So then that brings us to Boneshatter. What's important in Boneshatter is literally just these two things right here: Magnified Effect and Impact Shockwave. Now you can see I have 2 additional slots here. I literally couldn't think of anything better to do on Boneshatter than just give it less cost. Originally I had 4 slots in here, but I quickly realized Boneshatter was killing enemies so hard that it wasn't really worth using a valuable damage gem on Boneshatter. When Boneshatter kills packs of enemies, you've seen that even the rare enemies, if you catch them in the multi-explosion, will just get completely shredded. Their bones are gone, their existence is gone, their grandfather has been erased from time. So why is that? Why is that happening? Okay. So we got Magnified here, which gives it more AoE effect. Now I have removed most of the AoE from my skill points, which I'll get into later, but Boneshatter continues to be a massive AoE anyway. So we have Magnified Effect, giving it 40% more AoE range, and then we have Impact Shockwave. Now Impact Shockwave recently got buffed to have a 2-meter heavy stun radius. So Boneshatter by itself on the Shockwave is 2 meters radius, and now also Impact Shockwave is 2-meter radius. So this means, as compared to before where I needed a lot of AoE nodes to get this to kind of get anywhere, I don't really need that many right now. Now, once we do have Impact Shockwave, what will... this is going to sound really dumb, but what happens is if... and you can see this, I'll hopefully, if you go back to the beginning of the video, but hopefully I can edit in some footage here, you can see if you hit an enemy with Boneshatter, it will hit an enemy, and then the Impact Shockwave will break out of them, right? Then if that Impact Shockwave hits an enemy and they die, it will then Impact Shockwave again. And if that Impact Shockwave hits an enemy, it will then go out and it'll Impact Shockwave again. So if you see me do any of these real quick animations like that, and then just everyone is dead, that's what's going on. It's really this ability. So as I keep explaining in all my videos, but I really need to keep hammering this home, because you see in my videos, I've kind of got it down to a science, and I can keep doing it over and over and over again. The point of this build is not actually to be slow. When people think shield builds, they're thinking, I'm going to move around very slowly. No. So we have the mobility on the shield. We're not being actually that slow. Obviously, we're slower than walking, but we're not stopping to attack. Now, this kind of goes into survivability, okay? But let me talk about that in 1 second. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do this. Now when you hear the armor explosion, generally speaking, that means they're gonna be primed to stun. Then once they're primed to stun, you just bonk, bonk, boom, and then you just dodge roll out of the end of that animation. Especially once you get some quality onto Boneshatter, that 20% more attack speed. It's 60% of base by default, but almost the entirety of that attack is spent on the recovery frames at the end. The developers have, as I keep mentioning in every video, they have done such a poor job of actually designing melee in this game. So you can actually see here, you can literally even just shield right out of the animation. You don't even need to do this. Do you see that? So that's actually one thing you can do. You can cancel the end of this animation with a dodge roll to like reposition for more attacks, or you can I probably don't do it as much because it's not just in my muscle memory right now, but you can literally just do that and go back into shielding, so you don't really have to spend any time. The actual damage of this attack, if you're looking, comes out when about the weapon is around here on your character. So if you're seeing like that, you can like get out of this animation so quickly that it's crazy. It honestly makes no sense. Most of these attacks could actually have their attack speed straight up increased to 100%, and it really wouldn't affect anything because most of the time you can just cancel the end of the animation anyway. I think the only thing is the developers, maybe their thoughts were that like, because this is the cooldown of the attack, they didn't want you to like they didn't want you to like use the attack and then just randomly like stand around and then use the attack and then just randomly stand around. Maybe for like visual clarity, it's good for like signifying that like you're not able to attack because you're like recoiling. But the problem is, and here's where this gets really dumb, you can actually do this if you really wanted to. In fact, it gets even worse. You can actually if you actually just continuously cancel your attacks with block, you can actually just attack quicker than you could otherwise. It gets a little bit of server error there, but you see the, yeah. The developers have really just not coded this well. I hope at some point they adjust this, because to be honest, I think that this will probably be an issue, maybe with people doing like macros or things like that, to eventually set this up to do higher damage. Anyway, I just wanted to say that that's the most important part here, to Resonating Shield, Boneshatter, Resonating Shield, Boneshatter, Resonating Shield, Boneshatter, Resonating Shield, and that's a really good way to clear out enemies. Again, some people have complained that Resonating Shield is eating all their mana. You don't need Demolisher, because on bosses you can keep up the armor shred very easily. Once the armor shred is like on the boss, just bonk every so often, you're good to go, right? So you block a single attack and bonk, and you know that's up for another 10 seconds, right? On the normal enemies, just spam mana potions and you'll be fine that way, right? Just kind of get into the habit of spamming mana potions. Don't really bother to waste your time on anything else. So then where have I kind of ran into issues with this build? In my other videos, I was talking about this build, and that's where I got a lot of my ideas from. So in my last video, I kind of had a lot of ideas. I was mostly spamming AoEs, and I was looking in the comments, and a lot of people left a lot of comments that left me intrigued. I thought to myself, that's an interesting idea. I should look further into that information. Now, what were those things that I saw? So basically, despite rage when hit by an enemy not proccing on block, armor and attack speed when hit by an enemy does proc on block. Now, of course, this attack speed is very high right here, 7, then 7, then 12%. This is a lot of attack speed right here, and this will proc if you block an attack. So your bonking here will actually reach a higher attack speed if you block one attack every 4 seconds, which is not particularly hard to do. In addition to that, we've just made some general adjustments to the tree as a whole. I went a bit, and I am, of course, level 92 at this point, so we're pretty deep in here, right? But I stretched over here and grabbed Blaze Siege. I mean, it's definitely a good idea, because once I have these 4 over here, I have, whenever I've blocked with an attack, I get 25% more block. With my current weapon, that actually brings me to exactly 75% block. Now, I'm not sure if putting this many points in block has been a good idea, because you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 points right now into block. Instead, we could just rely on the active block being 100% and not worry about that at all. That would also allow us on our shield to maybe well, maybe not pay as much for a very good shield with high block chance. But I digress. I think maybe we could be relying more on active block and save those points up for some other things. But at any rate, we dropped the damage to close range enemies here. I'm not sure if that was a good or a bad idea, but I wanted to get with rage. I also wanted to get the skill cost over here. I think this has overall just been an improvement for smoothing over my gameplay, because we have the attack speed when we're hit here. We have the skill speed here. These things have helped us out a lot, actually. I repathed a little bit over here to grab more AoE effect over here rather than damage against stunned enemies. I think you do need a little bit of AoE. That's why I have the AoE here, I have the AoE here, and I have the AoE here. Because I do think you do need to hit enemies with a little bit more AoE, or else, eventually, if you give Boneshatter like a little bit of breathing room, if you give it like a little bit more than an AoE it's supposed to have, then that allows it to chain proc a lot more, which helps it out immeasurably. Down here, of course, we have the break armor, because we do focus so heavily on break armor. I just went and grabbed some giga damage against fully broken armor enemies. This is mostly for bossing. As you've probably seen, this build clears packs of enemies without any issue whatsoever. So we're not really worried about packs of enemies anymore. The resonating shield and the Boneshatter have just completely stomped out packs of enemies. Now this leads us into how we deal with bosses and things like that. I have ran into a recurring problem where I'm pretty sure Warrior has been min-maxed out at this point, and unfortunately the best way to play Warrior is, from what I've seen, to go entirely into a bleed build. Bleeding on Hammer of Gods, especially with a Seismic Cry, seems to be basically the best way to play the class, and nothing else really comes close. If I put this into paint for you guys, and this is kind of I've been running into issues trying to theorycraft this build to be more interesting than just, well, I guess generic. The problem right now with Path of Exile and how they do things, all your damage leads into something, right? So all your damage leads into a hit. Then once you hit an enemy, it causes a bleed, right? So normal bleed does damage based on 15% of the damage dealt by the attack over time. But then when you affect bleed magnitude and bleed duration and things like that, bleed builds can take that bleed and magnify it so much that actually over time you're dealing up to like 300-400% of the damage that you dealt with the attack. If you watched a lot of these high-end warriors, you've probably seen a recurring thing where they hammer gods after a seismic cry, so it goes boom, boom, shockwaves, procs bleed, they aggravate the bleed, and the boss's health bar goes do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. So the game right now is not really balanced, and I haven't really wanted to do the Hammer Gods build because it feels super cheesy to me. So what I try to do is a Rage build. Now, I don't think the Rage build is that great, but it is really, really funny and leads me to be the world's angriest drummer boy. So in order to accent my Rage build, which I, again, think is just a really, really funny build, especially because I have no way actually in my runes to generate Rage. I rely entirely on Rage being generated by jewels, which I think that's got to be a developer oversight, but I think axes are supposed to be the Rage weapon, which I will get into later. But anyway, we have more max Rage here, 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 and here. So this is 3, 6, 9, and then this is 17 more maximum rage. Then up here we get 4 more maximum rage, so we have 51 more maximum rage. Then our loss of rage is significantly slower and starts later here, allowing us to keep it up more. For jewels, over here we get 3 rage when hit by an enemy. Down here we get a rage when we hit an enemy, 3 rage when hit by an enemy. Over here we don't have any rage, and then over here we get 1 more rage when hit by an enemy. So we hit an enemy, we get 2 rage. If we get hit, we get 6 rage. Now rage doesn't work on block, so the rage when hit primarily, it doesn't come in that often because as I was trying to mention earlier, one thing this build is doing is trying to stay mobile. One of the best things you can do to be tanky is to not be in a single position. As of right now, all melee attacks make you so immobile that all they tend to do is get you killed. I don't think the developers really balanced melee that well in this game. In fact, it seems freakishly underpowered. I think they're gonna have to do something with melee. I'm not really sure what. I have a couple ideas. One thing I was kind of looking into, and one thing that definitely seemed to be a good idea is maybe Life Thief should be entirely changed. Maybe there should be a version of Life Thief that only procs on melee attacks that just leeches a little bit more. But for now, what we do have is that very thing I just mentioned. What we do have to try and encourage us to run and actually hit people in close range and reward us for getting close to enemies and actually hitting them is, of course, we swapped over to Berserk. Now what Berserk does is you get 0.2% of your rage as life leech. So because we have 51%, that'll be about, so if you look into that perspective, that'll be about 10% of damage leached. So that's pretty good because rage currently only procs up on melee. That's actually one thing. Well, actually, rage doesn't actually, now that I look into it, all the ways to generate rage are from melee or they're from being hit, but actually, ironically, it doesn't actually have a melee requirement. It's just the only way to generate right now is from melee. But actually, if you could find a way to generate rage without being melee, there's actually no downside to it, which is kind of weird. But anyway, this means with our 51 rage, we get about 10% of physical damage leached back as HP, but we do lose about 5% of our health per second. Now that health loss is pretty mitigated pretty easily. On my gear here, you can see I'm already healing 2.32%, so that removes half the health loss on its own. We've also got, do I have any health regen? Yeah, we've got a few health regen items strewn about. Do we actually only have one anymore? Okay, we got the one health regen item. Then we have another health regen over here, 0.5% from Titan. Then we have another 0.5% over here. So overall, I would wager we're only losing like about 1% of our health per second to this effect, but then we're leeching back 10% of the damage we deal over 10 seconds. So I did this whole long-winded discussion to basically bring up what I've been doing for damage. I basically decided, look, if we're doing the dumbest build possible, why don't we just end this in the dumbest way possible? So then I just went Mace Strike. Now, this is when I realized that there just wasn't enough support in the game right now to try to help what I'm doing. And I will go into that in a second, but what did I do with Mace Strike? I used Concentrated Effort. Now, I'm not sure Concentrated Effort should be usable on your left click, but it is. It does bug it out. Very often your Mace Strike doesn't actually have enough AoE to attack who you want to attack anymore, but because Mace Strike is technically counted as an AoE attack, you are allowed to put Concentrated Effort on it, which means that those bosses and other characters that you just walk up and beat the crap out of, you're getting a 40% damage modifier. Then I give it 25% attack speed, I give it more damage against bleeding enemies, I give it fire infusion so it does more fire damage, and then I give it close combat so it does more damage to enemies that are closer to me. So if I'm healing 10% of the damage and I run up and I whack people really quick, I do a lot of damage. Now, this all works, and with 51% and 51% more damage from Berserk, and then of course we have the well, I should say 51% more damage from Rage, and then Berserk, because I put this to 20% quality and have this at level 19, we actually have this to an 80% total more damage from Rage, which has actually been working pretty good for us with this stupid build. The problem I quickly ran into is, as of right now, maces do not have a good rage spender. I'm going to call it that. They don't have a good rage spender. I could keep rage on my main hand attack, but I quickly realized the only ways to spend rage right now are you can get a lot of endurance charges, which we can't do anymore because we don't have magma barriers, so we don't really have ways to generate a lot of endurance charges. But what you could do is Seismic Cry, supported war cries consume 10 rage, and then all attacks empowered by this war cry deal 30% more damage. So what you can do is you can use Seismic Cry to eat 10 rage. It spends your rage and then does more damage on the attacks after that, which we typically use on Hammer the Gods. The thing after that I wanted to do is I wanted another ability that had Rage Forge in it to consume rage to deal more damage. Now, of course, as you might imagine, the problem I ran into is there's currently no good rage spender for warriors, at the very least for maces. there's not a single good ability to spend rage on. Let me actually go into why this is, because it actually gets really complicated and really stupid. So we want an ability that does a big hit and procs bleed. Then, because we've got all this rage, that bleed will hit for a decent amount of damage, even with no modifiers on it. It's going to hit for 75% of the damage of the attack over time. So we get a spender, it bleeds the enemy. And then on our main hand, we do 30% more physical damage if the enemy is bleeding. So we left click, right click, or whatever spender you have. Basically, we're trying to make this into Diablo 4, right? Diablo 4 bad game, whatever, right? But that's the general idea. But the problem is, hear me out on this one. Supercharged Slime is way too slow and can't really be used like that. Size Stampede is stupid and I just don't even want to use it. It just animates poorly, and to be honest, it doesn't even do that much damage anyway, so it would definitely not be that great for this build, right? So that leaves us with Sunder. Now, of course, could Sunder be used for this build? Yes, and actually with Fissure, I found Sunder was really good in this build. The problem is, because we are Resolute Technique and we cannot crit, currently, Sunder consumes broken armor on enemies to ensure it gets a critical hit, and then cannot critical hit. So all Sunder does is remove the broken armor on enemies, on the bosses, because on normal enemies we don't care. They're dying in one hit. We don't care about them, right? All the rare enemies, the magic enemies, all these enemies we don't care. We're only caring about bosses. Can we kill bosses? I did, in fact, kill bosses, but let's just say it was a little bit slower than I wanted it to be. So we can't really use Sunder to be our big damage against bosses, because unfortunately that's just not how it works. Okay, so Sunder's just going to remove our armor, our broken armor on enemies. That's no good. So that brings us to Leap Slam. Leap Slam, in addition to not doing that much damage, I think it does, yeah, it does less than even Stampede, but it animates a little quicker than Stampede for the most part. So maybe you could say it's good, but the problem is Leap Slam also consumes fully broken armor to cause stun. So we can't use Sunder as our spender. We can't use Leap Slam as our spender. Earth Shatter is just not very good. Molten Blast, no. Perfect Strike, no. Neither of these abilities would be good for bleeding an enemy, even if that's what we were trying to do. You could maybe say Perfect Strike, but then that really questions, you know, we can't life leech on fire damage, we only life leech on physical damage, right? So we have to have a physical damage ability to work with Berserk. So that, of course, leaves us to maybe Earthquake, which is a joke. We're not using that one. Boneshatter, which we can only use once per stun. Bosses generally don't get stunned that much. Most late game bosses have so much stun resist and take so long to stun that it's not really consistent to Boneshatter them. And in addition to that, the biggest issue is that they also take half stun damage after being stunned. So no matter how much stun you get, unless you like overclocking your stun into infinity, there's really no way you're going to be able to double stun bosses. I've done it to lower level bosses, but certainly none of the higher level ones, right? So that leaves us Rolling Slam. Rolling Slam is still broken, and I kid you not, the aftershock on the second attack, despite having a visual, still does no damage. Additionally, Rolling Slam just has comically low DPS, and it's just really jank to try to use on bosses. What'll frequently happen is I try to use it on a boss, they'll slightly miss position, and like this attack goes into nowhere. Or, worst case scenario, you use it into the boss and like the Rolling Slam goes right past them and it doesn't even AoE into them. So like, if I'm trying to like hit this boss, sometimes it'll do like jank shit like that. And you're just like, all right, you know what I mean? You're like, okay, hit the boss. And your character is just like, and you're just like, all right, cool. So Rolling Slam is also not a good spender. So the problem I had with this build, and last time I theory crafted, a lot of people did actually come into the comments and they did say, oh, well, you know, this stuff still works on block, and that actually helped my build a lot, because then I could resonating shield, and I realized, oh, I can get a lot of bonks. And I mean, that's basically it. I'm just like bonk, 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 right? And so I was able to go with that. But in this case, I literally do not think there's currently any support for this build. What the developers would have to do is add another ability that ends up being a good spender, maybe at a lower cooldown. Hammer the Gods is fine, and I do use it, but like, you know, it is on a 20-second cooldown. You can't really use that as your spender, right? You can't keep enemies bled with that ability by any search of imagination, right? So Hammer the Gods is just not where we're at right now. But I think the developers would need to either buff Rolling Slam to actually be more usable against bosses or something. Earth Shatter, they would have to make Sunder either not consume armor if you couldn't crit, or if it could still crit through Resolute Technique, that would be really nice. It's not, I don't think warriors are like particularly overpowered. It would mean every warrior would just go Resolute Technique anyway, but I don't think warriors are so strong right now that like a buff like that would break the class at any rate. Maybe it would, who can say, right? Anyway, until we get a new ability or some buffs or something, I'm kind of at a loss because I don't really have a way to spend rage in this build. Additionally, if the developers made rage on hit actually work on block, what I could probably do is do a jank version of this build where I just run up to enemies and I just whack them repeatedly. The problem with that is that in the late game, magic damage starts going a little bit nuts. In fact, if I look at my maps here, I've got this doomed map right here where I'm cursed with elemental weakness. That one seems to be a pretty common ailment. Enemies can get damage and they can get cast speed, but the more common thing is enemies get these like extra damage as chaos damage. I've pretty much deleted all of mine. Enemies get more damage as chaos damage, lightning damage, cold damage, fire damage, and they can combine two of those. And you can get those, and you can get elemental weakness, and you can get reduction to resistances. Either rate, despite the buffs to resistances they did a few days ago, despite that being really good for warriors to be able to get into maps without instantly getting one shot, the problem is the further and further into maps you go, the more you're going to notice that armor is useless. Now that's actually a pretty big change to my build that you've probably noticed. I've removed almost all my armor nodes. So what have I noticed? Am I squishier? Am I dying? No, I haven't noticed anything. In fact, the biggest thing I noticed when I removed almost all my armor nodes was, wait, I literally don't feel a difference. And I don't. I literally don't feel a difference. The big boss one-shots that one-shot you, we're still one-shotting you through big armor. The smaller enemies are basically doing no damage to you anyway. I literally do not notice a difference with all my armor nodes gone. It gets even worse once you remember that because you have 75% block, only 25% of the damage is going into your armor anyway. Now, heat proofing, this node here does make your armor apply to fire damage, which does for the most part invalidate fire damage and not really make it a big issue anymore. But this does have a problem that all that's doing is affecting fire damage. Now, if there was some effect here where you could get this effect for all damage types, maybe like out of the Titan tree or something like that, maybe it would be better. But for the most part, what I've seen most people doing is they go Stone Skin and maybe Blade Catcher, and maybe they go through this line here, and that's basically all the armor they're gonna need. Heat proofing, good. Blade Catcher is still pretty good for not getting randomly crit. Stone Skin, this line here, and you're done. That's basically it, okay? So, what am I doing with the rest of my abilities then? Another thing that I did that I do think is pretty good, and you should be actually working with that, Shield Charge with Stomping Ground does a lot of damage. I sometimes have the increased cooldown reduction on it. I sometimes don't. It really depends on how I feel that day and how I want to do my things. At the rate, you'll generally notice you can drum, charge, drum, you know, and then you do the Boneshatter, and then you charge to the next location. So this build is very mobile. You just have to get good at using that mana key. It does not clear as slow as people think it does. I don't know why people think it clears slow. It's actually quite quick. You just do that Boneshatter, then you're off to the next area, right? So that works pretty good. Hammer of the Gods, I just have set up with Heavy Swing, Fist of War, Heft, and then I just went ahead and gave it a Lightning Infusion to just get it more damage. Ancestral Warrior Totem, we did do something interesting with this one. What we did do with Ancestral Warrior Totem, I put Stampede in here. Stampede's weirdly good to me out of the totem. I don't know why, it just works for me. But the main thing we did is Font of Rage and Ancestral Urgency. Now we did that because the primary use out of totems, particularly during boss fights, is to just get us more rage or to keep our rage up when an enemy is doing some weird flying animation or things like that. Because you can see here, we're going to bleed all our rage away as the boss is doing a thing. But if we do this, this is actually like a super jank way to keep our rage up so that we don't lose it all in weird parts of the boss fights, or because we're only getting 2 rage on a hit. We're not spending much rage, but we're only getting 2 rage on a hit. This really helps us to generate back up to that 50 rage at first. You know, some bosses can just do hard resets and get your rage down to the minimum, so it's kind of a good way to manage that. Rage doesn't really seem fleshed out, but I'm kind of hard forcing it anyway because it's really funny to me. It's just, I don't know, I like being the angry drummer boy. It's just really amusing to me. I just really like being the angry drummer boy. Yeah. So, do remember that rage, of course, let me go find it right here. Rage does more attack damage per rage gained. Pretty much everything you're doing here is attack. I literally can't think of anything here that's not attack. It doesn't have to be melee, but it does need to be attack. And I literally cannot think of anything in here that isn't, oh no, seismic cry damage isn't an attack. So I guess seismic cry doesn't get more damage, but that doesn't really seem to be affecting us that much. As for the rest of our changes, there haven't really been that many. I went ahead and I grabbed Unbending to get more life. I went ahead and grabbed Titanic to get more strength because, well, I really needed a lot of strength to wield this weapon. It is like King Arthur's sword if it was really, 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 really heavy. I basically need every single bit of strength in my entire tree to be able to wield this thing. It's not even that good too. That's what's funny when people look at my builds. By the way, one thing you should notice, these shield abilities like Resonating Strike, they scale very heavy with level, but they do not scale with your weapon. That's something very important. If any of you guys find a plus melee weapon ability and you want to just do Magma Barrier, Resonating Shield, stuff like that, these scale very, very heavily based on the level of the ability, but barely scale at all on your shield. These basically will not do more damage ever, really, for the most part. The damage added per armor of your shield is so irrelevant, even after the buff, it just doesn't matter. It's so impossibly small, you cannot even comprehend how little this matters. But, each time you level up the ability, the attack damage of the ability goes up, and then its base damage goes up, which is kind of weird how they do it like that. So basically, these abilities, you can see this right here, they have this fake imaginary base offhand physical damage. That just means they have a base damage of the ability itself. Then that base damage gets magnified by the attack damage of the ability itself, which is weird that, you know, they don't just list how much damage the ability is doing, but there you go. So basically they get more flat damage, which is then put through a higher multiplier each time you go. So plus melee skill, which I unfortunately don't have, actually does make these shield abilities do a lot more. Unfortunately, my shield charge is already, you know, basically for the most part one-shotting people, and it shield charge already does have a pretty good stun modifier. I also put rage on it. I'm not sure about that. I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm not sure I really like that, but I wanted to put rage somewhere, and I'd remove the cooldown reduction. Normally I'd have the cooldown reduction here, but I kind of finagled around with the build a little bit. At either rate, that's what I'm doing, and it's gotten me through all the content. I might do an update on this build if they do some buffs or add some new abilities, but other than swapping my rage over to a Hammer of the Gods Bleed, I don't really think there's much more I can do with this build. Unfortunately, what most warriors are doing right now is they're just dropping all the shield. They're holding a shield for the passive block chance, because that's just a lot of damage reduction, right? But what a lot of them are doing are just going with the Hammer of the Gods Bleed, which feels really cheesy to me, and I don't really like it. I don't think bleed builds should be focused on like one big damaging attack that you then just make them magnified. I think, in my mind, especially because like I think axes are going to be the bleeding weapon, I'm kind of hoping that they kind of adjust bleeds to be more focused on like hitting enemies a lot and building up bleeds on them, or something, right? It feels very jank to me that the best way to get a bleed build right now is to just use the 1 giga damaging attack, which for some reason can bleed for 300% of its damage. I don't know. But anyway, that's what I've been doing. That's my build. That's what I've been doing. It's been working really good for me, so I hope it works good for you. Oh, I should mention, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe. I probably need to put that in the video. But thank you guys. And as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day.